Geneva is in the spotlight. Ukraine, the US and Russia sit at the negotiation table under enormous pressure. Moscow refuses to back down, pushing demands over Donetsk while continuing strikes on civilian and energy infrastructure even during talks. Ukraine is proposing a temporary energy ceasefire to protect lives and infrastructure, but the Kremlin could use it to prepare new attacks. The US is reinforcing its team with top military leaders trying to keep the process on track. Trump pressures Kyiv instead of Moscow, pushing for quick decisions. 2025, the year Trump promised war over in 24 hours, revealed the true cost. Ukrainian civilians dying more frequently and Russia hitting harder, smarter and more brutally. Meanwhile, Budapest is blocking new EU sanctions, testing Western unity and accusing Kyiv of meddling in its elections. What happened next? Can the talks break the deadlock? And will Moscow make even the smallest concessions? All in the episode. Peace at risk. Kremlin stalls Geneva talks. On Tuesday, February 17th, Geneva is hosting the third round of trilateral talks between Ukraine, the US and Russia. The goal: find a way to end the full-scale war. Diplomatic pressure is high, with the Trump administration setting a hard deadline. A final deal must be signed by June 2026. This was reported by Reuters. The main obstacle in the talks remains Moscow's expansionist ambitions. The Kremlin demands full control over Donetsk, a position Kyiv calls completely unacceptable. Ukraine's delegation is led by Rustem Umerov, Secretary of the National Security and Defense Council, and Presidential Chief of Staff Kyrylo Budanov. Senior presidential aide Sergei Kyslytsya is also participating. Russia is represented by Vladimir Medinsky, a former cultural minister and revisionist historian whose pseudo-history is widely criticized in Ukraine. Also participating are military intelligence chief Igor Kostyukov and Putin's special envoy Kyrylo Dmitriev, who are working in a separate economic group. CNN reports that the US is reinforcing its delegation with Army Secretary Dan Driscoll and US Army Europe Commander Alex Grinkevich. Army Secretary Dan Driscoll and US Army Europe Commander Alex Grinkevich are not new at the peace process. They previously participated in trilateral talks in Abu Dhabi and in meetings between Ukrainian and US delegations in Miami. Speaking at the annual Munich Security Conference on Saturday, President of Ukraine Volodymyr Zelensky says he hopes that Geneva talks will be serious and substantive. At the same time, he notes that the sides' positions diverge. He also suggests that Russia's reshuffling of its negotiation team may be an attempt to buy time and delay peace agreement.
The surprise is that the Russians have changed the leader of their group. I believe they may be trying to delay a decision. Although I might be somewhat pessimistic about this. Nevertheless, we are counting on the American side and hope they will not allow the Russians to postpone the process or restart negotiations from scratch due to the change in the group's composition. I think that would be a serious mistake. I also hope the Americans will not let the Russians play games in this way.
Trump, however, continued to put pressure on Ukraine rather than Moscow. Ahead of the Geneva talks, US President Donald Trump said Ukraine should quickly sit down at the negotiation table with Russia. He spoke to journalists aboard Air Force One, emphasizing the need for swift action.
Well, they're big talks. It's going to be very easy. I mean, look, so far, Ukraine better come to the table fast. That's all I'm telling you. We are in a position we want them to come.
Meanwhile, US Secretary of State Marco Rubio struck a different tone. He assured that the US was not forcing either side to sign a peace deal and was only trying to help the parties reach an agreement. According to him, a peace deal was possible because the US could act as a mediator, something no other European country could do. The Americans aimed slowly to facilitate the process, not force anyone to sign.
All we are trying to do is play a role if it's possible in reaching a deal. We're not seeking to impose a deal on anybody. We're not trying to force anyone to take a deal they don't want to take. We just want to help them because we think it's a war that's incredibly damaging. We think it's a war that's incredibly destructive. We think it's a war that never should have happened and should end as soon as possible.
During the ongoing talks in Geneva, the Ukrainian side raised the issue of another temporary halt to attacks on energy infrastructure. National Security and Defense Council Secretary Rustam Umerov had stated on February 14th that the three-way talks with the US and Russia would address the possibility of a new short-term energy ceasefire to reduce damage to civilian infrastructure. At the same time, analysts warned that Russia could use any temporary moratorium on strikes against energy targets to create the appearance of willingness to make concessions. According to the US-based Institute for the Study of War, Moscow had previously imposed temporary pauses on attacks in March-April 2025 and January-February 2026, using these pauses to stockpile drones and missiles for subsequent destructive strikes. Specifically, during the moratorium on certain Ukrainian energy facilities in January-February this year, Russia agreed to pause strikes only after causing serious damage to Ukraine's energy network. Analysts noted that Moscow would likely again present compliance with any future short-term moratorium as a significant concession, even though the Russian military would use the period to build up weapons for larger strike packages. Experts at the Institute also emphasized that Russian officials are unlikely to abandon their initial military demands during the three-way talks between the US, Ukraine and Russia these days. Moscow has repeatedly demonstrated full commitment to achieving these objectives, so significant concessions should not be expected during the meeting. Meanwhile, Trump's promise on peace in 24 hours turned into a bloody year for Ukraine. 2025 casualty statistics shattered any illusion of a quick end to the war. Despite US President Donald Trump's statements, 2025 became one of the deadliest years for Ukrainian civilians. Civilian deaths rose by 26% and Russian attacks grew more deliberate and brutal. This was reported by The Independent. According to the human rights organization Action on Armed Violence, civilian casualties in Ukraine rose by 26% last year. There were 14,775 casualties compared to 11,765 in 2024, including 2,250 deaths, up to 11% from the previous year, and 2,525 injured, a 28% increase. Russian strikes increasingly targeted civilians deliberately to maximize casualties. Before taking office in January last year, Donald Trump had promised to end the war in 24 hours. CNN calculated that he repeated this claim 53 times during his campaign. Later, the US president said he spoke figuratively as Moscow's continue massive night attacks in eastern Ukraine. Ahead of Geneva peace talks, Russia continued its strikes on Ukraine, ignoring diplomatic efforts. Ukrainian Foreign Minister Andriy Sybiha reported that the main targets were energy and civilian infrastructure. He stressed that Moscow only responds to pressure and that new sanctions blocking shadow fleets and travel restrictions for participants in the aggression remains critical.
The extent to which Russia disregards peace efforts, a massive missile and drone strike against Ukraine right before the next round of talks in Geneva. Main targets, energy and civilian infrastructure. Moscow only understands the language of pressure. It will not take diplomacy seriously if it is not backed by strength. New sanctions packages are critical. Blocking shadow fleet, maritime services ban, entry ban for participants of Russian aggression. Only our unity and strength will bring an end to this war.
On February 17th, Russia carried out massive missile and drone strikes across Ukraine, including the west of the country. Explosions were reported in Odessa, Dnipro, Kropyvnytsk and Burштyn. In Odessa, the strikes damaged the infrastructure facility and several civilian buildings, leaving 3 people injured. In Dnipro, a fire broke out, damaging a private business, administrative buildings, homes and vehicles. Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban said Kyiv had openly interfered in Hungary's election campaign, which opposes Ukraine's EU membership, including by directly supporting the opposition. He made the remarks at the joint briefing with the US Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who was visiting Budapest.
The Ukrainians and their president obviously have entered into the Hungarian election campaign. For a while I was thinking whether we should take that on the wrong note or not. I mean, with such brutal open centering into the election campaign of another country is not very frequent. You don't see that often. But then again, I realized it was understandable because the Hungarian elections is the most important to Hungarian people, but it has an impact beyond Hungary as well.
According to him, the Hungarian people in 2025 vote clearly rejected Ukraine's EU membership, arguing it would drag Hungary into the war and damage its economy. The current government also did not plan to send funds to Brussels that could then be forwarded to Ukraine. At the same time, Orban claimed that the Ukrainians wanted to see a new government willing to accept Ukraine's EU membership and take on its financial burden. He also accused the Ukrainian authorities of supporting his political opponents.
For the Ukrainians, it doesn't matter what the outcome of the elections will be. Therefore, they decided to participate in the campaign. And since we stand on the ground of common sense, we must not be surprised at that. We must adapt to it. And we must acknowledge that the Ukrainian president and Ukraine will be an active participant of this election, and we have to prevail against them too. That is our reality.
Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban not only accuses Ukraine of interfering in parliamentary elections, but is also blocking the introduction of a new sanctions package against Russia. According to Politico, the new restrictions on Moscow could face resistance from Budapest. The European Union is currently finalizing its 20th sanctions package against Russia. The report says the final decision on the sanctions package will come after 2 meetings of EU ambassadors in the Coreper 2 format. EU Foreign Policy and Security Chief Kaja Kallas had previously said the new sanctions against Russia should be adopted by February 21st. Given the tight timeline, diplomats could meet again in the coming days. Politico notes that the EU is seeking to strengthen sanctions with the help of the UK. Diplomats aim to coordinate measures against Russia's shadow fleet and ban maritime services for tankers carrying Russian oil and gas. The EU also wants to block loopholes that Russia has been actively exploiting. According to Politico, EU sanctions special envoy David O'Sullivan is working with partners outside the EU and is expected to visit Kyrgyzstan soon. At the same time, progress on the package is slowed by Hungary. Diplomats say Budapest insists on removing certain officials from Russian sports organization from the sanction list, which could delay adoption. Earlier on February 6th, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen presented the 20th package of sanctions. She emphasized that the EU would target cryptocurrencies and trading companies, as well as platforms that facilitate their exchange to close avenues for sanctions evasion. That's all for today. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel and leave your comments below.